ladies and gentlemen, seekers of truth, there comes a time in one's journey where words begin to fail, not from confusion, but from clarity. After the long and arduous path of healing the inner child, we find not a loud celebration, but a great, resonant silence. And that silence is not empty. It is full of meaning, full of being. But why does silence follow the healing of the inner child? Let us begin here with the shadow. The inner child is not merely a symbol of innocence. It is also the bearer of wounds. It carries unmet needs, abundant joy, and silent cries echoing from forgotten rooms in the psyche. To heal is to descend into the underworld of the self and make peace with the ghosts that have long haunted our waking lives. We meet fear not with force, but with presence. We do not slay the shadow, we integrate it. And once the battle within has ceased, once the cries of the child have been heard and held, a great silence falls. It is the silence that follows the end of a war, a silence that holds both grief and grace. Then comes the return to wholeness. For what is healing if not the gathering of scattered pieces of the soul? The inner child is not a relic of the past, it is a living fragment of the self. When we welcome it home, something ancient and sacred stirs within us. The fracture becomes whole, the fragmented becomes one, and in that unity there is no need to speak, there is no performance, no proving. There is only presence. Silence becomes the natural language of the whole self. And finally, we must understand that silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of self. When the inner child is healed, we no longer cry out to be seen. We see ourselves. The compulsion to fill every space with words, every moment with noise, begins to fade. We no longer chase approval, for we have learned to sit in our own company. In that sacred space of stillness, the soul breathes, the soul still breathes, the spirit rests. And the true self emerges not with a shout, but with a whisper. So yes, silence comes after inner child healing, not as a void, but as a homecoming, a sanctuary, a return. To understand why silence comes after inner child healing, we must begin with the encounter that precedes it, the confrontation with the shadow. The inner child is not merely a symbol of youthful innocence, it is also the keeper of old pain, unmet needs, and unspoken truths buried deep within the unconscious. While many associate the inner child with joy and spontaneity, it is often first found in a state of deep sorrow, trapped in the echoes of abandonment, shame, or fear. The healing does not begin with light, but with the courage to walk into this darkness. The shadow is not an enemy, it is a forgotten part of the self. It is everything we have repressed or denied, our rage, our vulnerability, our terror. And the inner child lives within that shadow, frozen in the moment it first learned the world was unsafe. To begin healing, we must descend. We must walk past the masks we wear for others, past the noise of external validation, and into the silence where the forgotten child waits. This descent is not metaphorical. It is psychic. It is a return to moments we try to erase, to memories we disown, to feelings we never gave ourselves permission to feel. It is in this descent that the psyche trembles, the ego resists. It does not want to look at the raw, unedited truth of who we were and what we endured. But the soul knows this is the path. Healing begins when we stop trying to fix or erase the pain and instead choose to witness it, to hold it, to let the child speak in their own voice. There is often weeping in this place, not just emotional, but spiritual. A mourning for the years we spent disconnected from our own essence. The child might speak in dreams. It might come through the tremble in our voice, the sudden fear of abandonment, the unexpected tears. As we listen, truly listen, the battle within begins to quiet. Not because it is over, but because it has been seen. And what is seen can finally be soothed. This process is not about finding perfect understanding. It is not cognitive. It is relational. The adult self must become the protector and companion that the child never had. This is not a performance of love. It is an act of reparenting that happens on the deepest level of the psyche. And when the child realizes it is no longer alone, something begins to shift. The storm begins to settle. It is after this reconciliation, after the shadow has been embraced and the child held, that the silence begins to arrive. But the silence is unlike the silence of repression. It is not the silence of suppression, of words choked down and emotions hidden. It is the silence that follows truth. A deep sacred stillness that emerges when the psyche no longer needs to scream, when the cry for help has been heard, when the wound is no longer ignored, but acknowledged. This silence is not immediate. It comes gradually, like dusk turning to night. It comes as the body softens, as the nervous system learns safety, as the soul breathes freely for the first time in years. It is the silence of peace. Not the peace that comes from escaping the world, but the peace that comes from returning to oneself, from integration. Thus, silence is not an afterthought. It is a signpost, a quiet, holy echo of healing. When the inner child has been met, loved, and reintegrated into the whole, the constant noise of seeking, pleasing, hiding begins to fade. In its place comes the stillness of presence, the calm of self-acceptance, and it is there in that silence that the soul speaks again. Healing the inner child is not merely an act of emotional repair. It is a return to a forgotten wholeness. When we speak of the child within, we are speaking of a fragment, a piece of the self that split off long ago, usually in response to pain too great for the psyche to hold at the time. This fragmentation is not a failure of the soul, but a survival instinct. The child retreats into the unconscious, hiding the tenderest parts of our being, our wonder, our vulnerability, our sensitivity, and yes, our wounds. To survive, the psyche divides. To heal, it must reunite. In this process of return, we are not becoming someone new. We are remembering who we were before we learned to forget. The healing of the inner child is not linear. It is not about fixing or changing that child, but rather allowing them to come back into our awareness with all their raw truth. This is the sacred reunion. When we meet the part of ourselves we abandoned in order to belong, in order to feel safe, in order to be loved. This reconnection requires a willingness to feel what was never allowed to be felt. Anger that was silenced, grief that was suppressed, longing that was mocked or ignored. And just as we must face the pain, we must also reclaim the light. The laughter that was once effortless, the ability to wonder, to imagine, to believe in beauty. The inner child is the guardian of both trauma and treasure. When we open the door to their return, we open ourselves to the full spectrum of our humanity. What follows is not immediate bliss, it is integration. There is a slow, sacred unfolding. The inner child does not return with noise and spectacle. It returns with trust, with time, with presence. And when it does, we begin to feel something unfamiliar. We no longer feel divided. The parts of us that once worked in opposition, one trying to protect, one trying to be seen, one trying to hide, begin to harmonize. This inner alignment is what we often call peace. And it is from this peace that silence arises, not as a void, but as a natural consequence of no longer being at war with oneself. When the child is no longer exiled, there is nothing left to chase, no identity to prove, no applause to seek. The internal noise, the restlessness, the overthinking, the self-criticism begins to dissolve. The psyche no longer shouts over its own wounds, it rests. We often think of silence as the absence of sound, but in truth, this kind of silence is the presence of something greater, unity. When we are whole, we do not need to announce it. When we are at peace, we do not need to convince others. There is a quiet confidence that comes with inner reunion, a calm that doesn't depend on the external world. In this silence, something beautiful begins to happen. We listen not just to others, but to ourselves. We begin to hear the deeper rhythms of life, the soft voice of intuition, the pulse of the soul. We are no longer rushing to escape ourselves. We are finally able to sit in our own presence without fear, without urgency, without shame. The silence that follows healing is a sanctuary, not a sentence. And so healing the inner child is not an ending, it is a return, a reweaving of what was torn, a remembering of what was forgotten. And when the pieces come back together, the noise fades, the drama quiets, the masks fall away. What remains is the truth of who we are, whole, present, unshaken. And in that truth there is silence, not because there is nothing left to say, but because nothing more needs to be said. After the inner child is healed and the fragmented pieces of the self are reunited, something profound shifts within the psyche. It is as though a veil has been lifted, not just between the conscious and the unconscious, but between the self and the world. There is a stillness that follows this healing, not because the world has stopped moving or because the problems of life have been solved, but because the need for external validation has diminished. In this deep silence, the soul rests in its own truth. It no longer seeks external affirmation, it is content in its own presence. This is not silence born of repression or avoidance, but of acceptance and wholeness. Before this inner reconciliation, there is often a constant drive, a longing for recognition, for love, for proof that we are enough. We chase success, approval, affection, and praise, all the while believing that these will fill the void left by the unmet needs of our childhood. The inner child, when wounded, seeks to be seen, heard, and loved in ways that are often outside of our conscious control. We may unconsciously try to gain love by performing, by proving our worth, by overcompensating in one area of life or another. This becomes a constant hum within the psyche, a noisy, restless energy that never quite settles. But when the inner child is healed, this need begins to dissolve. There is no longer the urgency to perform or to seek validation from others. The self has returned to its own center, and in this return, the need for external approval falls away. The silence that emerges is not the silence of emptiness, but of contentment. It is the kind of quiet that arises when you no longer feel compelled to fill every moment with words, actions, or distraction. The soul, now whole, no longer seeks to be anything other than what it already is. This silence, then, is not a denial of the world or an escape from it. It is a profound acknowledgement of one's own inherent worth and completeness. It is a recognition that the loudest, most powerful voice we can hear is our own inner voice, the voice that comes from a place of truth, peace, and acceptance. When we heal the inner child, we learn to sit in our own company without discomfort, without needing to be somewhere else or someone else. We find peace within ourselves, and in that peace there is silence. Moreover, this silence becomes a space for deeper reflection and understanding. When we are no longer caught in a cycle of seeking and striving, we open up to a new kind of listening. We listen not just with our ears, but with our hearts. We listen to the subtle whispers of intuition, the quiet nudges that guide us toward truth. We begin to hear the rhythms of our own soul and the call of our deeper purpose. In this silence, there is a quiet communication with the universe, an understanding that transcends words and concepts. It is the language of the soul, the voice that speaks in the quiet spaces between thoughts. The silence that comes after inner child healing also brings with it a sacred solitude. Solitude in this sense is not loneliness. It is a deep connection with the self. In our healing journey, we learn that to be alone does not mean to be abandoned. To be in solitude is to be in the company of our own soul, to cultivate a relationship with ourselves that is not dependent on the presence or approval of others. This solitude is nourishing. It is a space where we can hear our true desires, dreams, and fears, and where we can connect with our own creative power. In this silence, we also experience a deep sense of freedom. We are free from the need to prove ourselves, free from the internal chatter of self-doubt and insecurity. We no longer feel the need to justify our existence or to be anything other than who we are. This freedom is not about escaping from the world, it is about engaging with the world from a place of wholeness. We are no longer fragmented. We are no longer caught in a constant struggle for validation. We are simply present, fully alive, fully aware of our own worth. So silence becomes a language of the self, not because we have nothing to say, but because we no longer need to say anything to be heard. It is the language of being. It is the voice of the soul whispering that we are enough, that we are whole, and that we are worthy of love simply as we are. In this silence, we find the deepest form of connection with ourselves. In closing, the silence that follows the healing of the inner child is not an absence, but a presence. It is a presence born from the integration of our fragmented selves, from the quiet understanding that we are no longer at war with our own story. It is the peace that arises when the shadows of our past are no longer feared or denied, but embraced with compassion and understanding. It is the calm that comes when we stop searching for validation and start honoring our own worth. This silence is not passive or empty. It is a profound and sacred space where the soul finds its true voice, where the rhythms of our authentic self are finally heard. It is a silence of wholeness, where we no longer need to prove our existence, for we have already become who we were always meant to be. In this silence, we listen deeply to the wisdom within, to the gentle whispers of intuition, and to the quiet guidance of our own soul. Healing the inner child is not a one-time event, but a journey of reclaiming our own essence. And the silence that comes after this healing is a reflection of that return to self. It is the quiet confidence of knowing that we are enough, just as we are, and that we no longer need to seek outside ourselves for the love and validation that we once craved. In this sacred stillness we find freedom, not from the world, but within it. We become whole, and in our wholeness we rest in the profound truth that the most powerful voice we will ever hear is our own. Thank you.